So if you find this sleep story helpful or interesting, then give it a thumbs up, leave any comments that you've got below, and if you aren't already, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you can receive notifications of when future sleep stories go live. I have dozens and dozens of stories already on my channel that you can go and search. I also release new stories every single week, so I hope you enjoy this story. So as you take a moment to close your eyes and begin to drift comfortably asleep, I'm just going to tell this guided sleep meditation in the background. And this guided sleep meditation is about a woman who has gone on holiday to a log cabin in a pine forest just on the edge of the Arctic Circle. And she arrives at that log cabin, and she's aware of the crisp and cold air on arrival, the white of the snow blanketing the surrounding area, the dusting of snow in the pine forest. And she heads into that log cabin. She lights a fire, makes herself a drink, and decides to just take a moment to sit down comfortably in the chair near the fire as she warms herself up. And while she sits and relaxes in that chair, she's holding a warm drink, and she can feel that warmth of the drink in the palms of her hands. As she brings that drink up to her mouth, she can feel the warmth of the steam tickling her face. And she sits and relaxes, listening to the crackling of that log fire. And while she's sitting and relaxing, so she drifts comfortably inside her mind and begins to drift into a reverie. And she starts to imagine what it would have been like to be in this area many years ago, many years before cabins like this were built. And as she begins to imagine this in her mind's eye, she has this sense of walking through deep snow, the sound of pushing through that snow, the sound of the wind rushing around her ears, walking towards an igloo. And she has this sense of entering that igloo, feeling that relief of being out of the wind, and how, despite this being a property built out of snow, it seems so much warmer than outside. And she continues with this reverie, imagining what life would have been like, how people would have eaten their food, kept warm, the clothing they would have worn. And she imagined what it would be like at night time, especially with the air being still and having a certain crispness to the air. And as she continued to imagine this, and imagining what it would be like at night time in an igloo, in her reverie, she could notice the stars in the sky, the thick blanket of stars with the colour of an aurora, gently moving over the face of those stars. And she thought to herself about how it's quite rare for people to see things like that nowadays. And even in the cabin that she's in, The cabin generates light, reducing the visibility of the blanket of stars, dulling down slightly the impact of the aurora. And that even though she's a long way from built-up areas, there's still the faintest of glow from cities in the distance, filling the night sky. And she's tried to take photographs of the night sky before, and noticed that with her eyes she may not notice the amount of light pollution there is, but she's aware that when you take a photograph over a long exposure, the glow from the light pollution becomes evident, and you realize how much light there is. And she continued to think about the way that people used to live and survive in this landscape, how they'd find food, and how they would conserve energy. And then as the evening set in, she decided just to go for a little walk down by the lake. And she left the cabin, and as she walked out the cabin door, she could hear the sound of crunching through the snow. She could notice that she was leaving behind that warmth. And as she glanced back, she could notice the glow of the cabin. And she walked down to the shore of the lake. And for a little way from the shore out into the lake was a layer of ice, and she could hear the sound of that water rolling in to the shore, and the way it would lap on the underside of the ice sheet, and the popping sounds, and the occasional cracking sound. And she walked over to the edge of the lake and just gently rested her foot on the ice, applying enough pressure just to crack that ice underfoot. And she found something pleasurable about cracking that ice under her feet. And she did so carefully, just in the very shallow edge of the lake, and then watched as the cracked ice would spread, and then the ice would begin to float on the water, and just the slightest tap with her foot sent the ice sheets floating out into the lake. And she sat down by the water, listening to the way that water reached the shore, listening to the wind gently rustling leaves in the trees, gazing up at the sky, at the beauty of this area, feeling a sense of peace and tranquility. And she came out here to have some time alone, to really connect and find herself. And she intentionally is leaving her technology off while she's out here. And as she looked around, while sat down by the lake, so she noticed a little way away around the lake what looked almost like a bluey purple flower, growing all alone. And she was curious about that flower, so she went to explore. She wondered whether it would turn out to be a different colour, and perhaps it just looked bluey purple because of it being quite dark. And when she went over to it, she noticed that it was actually a bluey purple flower, that the stem and the leaves had a purpley tinge to them, and the petals themselves looked blue. And she almost felt that that flower seemed to be glowing gently under the minimal light at night. And she was curious what this flower was. She'd promised herself that she wouldn't get her mobile phone out and would try not to use any technology for the duration of her stay away. She knew that that would have been the easiest way to find out what this flower was. But she also realised that she appreciated this moment and what she could see here more, because of the fact that she wasn't going to be able to capture this moment. That there's something about capturing a moment on a camera or on some other form that makes it so that your brain almost thinks it doesn't have to remember it so well. And she decided that the next day she was going to come out, find out what that flower is, and see what it looks like in daylight. And she headed back to the log cabin, settled down, and drifted and floated comfortably, relaxed asleep. And the next day she left the cabin, and she went and looked at that flower, and in daylight it still looked like it had a purple tinge to the stem, to the leaves, and that the petals were blue. And she didn't want to pick that flower, but wondered whether she could find more, so she decided to go exploring. She felt this one was growing near the lake, so perhaps she could explore further round the lake. And she walked around the lake, and after a number of hours of walking, she found a large patch of those flowers growing near the water's edge. And she also noticed, sat on a rock near the flowers, was a man just with his legs crossed, his eyes closed. She knew that there were other cabins around this lake, and so assumed it was someone staying in one of the other cabins. And she wondered whether he knew anything more about these flowers. So she went over to him, got his attention, and asked him about the flowers. And he explained that they're a rare flower, that once every 10 years or so they appear near this lake. A few nights after appearing, they release their seeds, and then a few days later they wither away and disappear, and that their seeds are quite magical to see, and that they do this under moonlight. And the woman was curious about this and wondered whether she'll get to see this spectacle. The man said that this hasn't happened yet, and so it should happen, perhaps tonight, or maybe in a day's time. And he said that if she wants, maybe she can come back here, or spend time here, so that she's here at night time, because there's far more of these flowers here than there are near her cabin. And she likes the idea of this, the idea of watching this spectacle take place. But to make sure that they don't miss anything, they've got to spend their time at night outside. And the woman has brought along some camping gear and a sleeping bag, and she'd brought it along just in case she needed it for an emergency, but felt that this is as good a time as any to use it. So she went back to her cabin, she got her gear, and that night she arrived back near those flowers. And the man was there and had already set up a tent, had already started a campfire. And she set up a tent diagonally near his, both facing the campfire, and both looking on towards those flowers. And she set up a time-lapse camera to film the flowers and film what goes on with them, hoping to get some good photos. And together they cooked up some food, and they started chatting, getting to know each other, sharing their reasons for coming out here. And the man explained that he chose this spot specifically for these flowers, and this moment in time specifically to see this event. That since being a child, when he first found out about these flowers, he'd been fascinated by the idea that one day perhaps he could get to see them. And now that time has arrived. And there are times when the two of them go quiet, just listening to the crackling campfire, just noticing the way the flame casts dancing shadows and light. And they relax and enjoy being in the moment. And then as they continue to relax, occasionally gazing over towards the flowers, so the campfire begins to burn right down to just embers. And they discussed intentionally allowing this to happen, so that they would have the warmth, but have reduced light interfering with their observations. And the woman noticed herself beginning to feel tired and kept wanting to drift off asleep. And the man said that they could take it in turns, perhaps one of them staying awake for a couple of hours while the other one has a nap, and then swapping over, and one can wake the other if anything happens. And so this is what they did, taking it in turns to have a nap. And then many hours into the night, when both of them were awake, they noticed something magical. They noticed all those flowers getting tiny little sparkling dots covering them. And then with just the slightest of breezes, the flowers would vibrate and sway very gently. And those tiny little sparkling dots, almost like glitter, began to fill the space above the flowers. And with that slightest of breeze, began to get caught in the breeze and spread and float and twinkle in the moonlight. The most beautiful sight, like glitter floating through the sky at night time. Watching as the seeds spread out from this area, where they'll land elsewhere. And the man said that they land, and they start growing a little bit to get themselves into the ground, to get a foothold. And then they remain dormant, only growing into flowers 10 years later. And the woman felt this was a magical experience to have been a part of. And they both fell asleep in their tents, until they were woken by the light of the sun shining onto the tents. And they spent some time talking, having something to eat, sharing different stories with each other, before the woman headed back to her cabin. And back at the cabin, the woman took the time to watch that footage back. She'd said that she was going to try and make the whole trip without using technology. But as she watched the time-lapse footage back she'd recorded on her camera, she felt so glad that she'd managed to capture that on film, something so rare, something that had she arrived a few days earlier, a few days later, had she arrived any other year, over recent years, and she would have missed that opportunity. And while she was watching the footage back, she was aware that the man hadn't recorded it. And she wondered whether he would like a copy of the footage. And so she walked back along. And so, looking back at that footage, she was glad that she had recorded it, because the time-lapse footage gave a different perspective on the event. It almost looked like the plants were purposefully doing their behaviours, that what she could observe looked like the plants were reasonably stationary, just vibrating and moving with the wind. But when she watched it back, she could see that actually there was a lot of complex behaviour going on in the way that the plants moved and acted. And she can get a better idea of the way the seeds managed to catch the wind, how they managed to float, and she noticed how each seed seemed to have some magnetic charge, that each seed seemed to repel itself from each other seed, ensuring that the seeds didn't land right next to each other, and that their trajectory would be subtly changed whenever they moved near each other, and that seemed to help the cloud of seeds propagate and spread out further. And although she didn't initially plan on coming on this breakaway to see this spectacle, she was so happy that she did. And she spent the next few days exploring the woods, sitting by the lake, sometimes just sitting in the cabin, reading a good book by the fire, listening to that crackling fire. Really taking time to be in the moment, not worrying about the past or the future or what's going on elsewhere, just being in the moment here and now. And then after her last night here, she travelled home. And once home, she went to bed, and thinking about the trip she'd been on, drifted and floated comfortably and relaxed, asleep.